Akhenaten. You're standing in the ruins of Tel El Amarna. The year is 1907. Sand fills your mouth. The desert wind cuts across broken limestone foundations that stretch to the horizon. Your name is Flinders Petrie, and you've just uncovered something that shouldn't exist. Fragments of a city, built in 4 years, abandoned in less than 20. Every single reference to its builder systematically destroyed. You hold a limestone relief in your hands. The hieroglyphs spell out a name that appears on no king list, no royal cartouche. No monument anywhere in Egypt. Amenhotep IV, who called himself Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who nearly destroyed 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. Petrie's excavations between 1907 and 1914 revealed the archaeological footprint of Akhenaten's capital city. The Deutsche Orient-Gesellschaft expedition, led by Ludwig Borchardt, discovered the famous bust of Nefertiti in 1912. But it was Barry Kemp's Amarna project, beginning in 1977, that revealed the true scope of the systematic destruction. Kemp documented evidence of deliberate demolition. Stone blocks from Akhenaten's temples were found incorporated into later constructions at Karnak and Luxor. The pharaoh's name had been chiseled from every monument. His successors' names were carved over his cartouches. Official king lists skip directly from Amenhotep III to Tutankhamun, erasing 17 years of Egyptian history. The archaeological record reveals an unprecedented religious revolution. Akhenaten abolished the worship of Amun-Ra and the entire Egyptian pantheon in favor of Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital from Thebes to a virgin site in Middle Egypt. He redistributed wealth from the temples to the crown. Most remarkably, he appears to have done this alone, without the support of the military or priesthood that traditionally upheld pharaonic power. Fragmentary archives from Amarna preserve correspondence with vassal states across the ancient Near East, suggesting his authority was recognized internationally despite the domestic upheaval. The mainstream explanation is that Akhenaten was a monotheistic visionary whose reforms collapsed after his death. His successors, particularly Horemheb, orchestrated a restoration that included the systematic destruction of Atenist monuments and the erasure of Akhenaten from official memory. The Amarna period represents a brief deviation from Egyptian orthodoxy that was corrected through traditional institutional mechanisms. The destruction was thorough but explainable as a religious counter-reformation. But the evidence suggests something more complex. Kemp's analysis of the destruction layers at Amarna reveals that the demolition began during Akhenaten's lifetime. Administrative papyri from the final years of his reign document supply shortages and abandoned construction projects. The systematic nature of the erasure goes beyond typical dynastic succession practices. Even pharaohs who were defeated in civil wars typically retained some mention in king lists. Akhenaten was deleted with a completeness that suggests active fear of his memory. Moreover, the speed of the transformation challenges conventional understanding of how ancient societies changed. Religious systems that had endured for millennia do not typically collapse in a single generation without extraordinary circumstances. The physical evidence at Amarna tells a story of rapid abandonment. Kemp found houses with meals still on tables, pottery workshops with unfinished vessels still on wheels, official seals scattered across administrative buildings as if dropped in haste. Radiocarbon dating of organic material confirms that the entire city was abandoned within months of Akhenaten's death, not gradually over years as would be expected in a normal transition of power. Some researchers suggest the abandonment was so sudden that it resembled a mass evacuation rather than an orderly relocation. The archives preserve fragments of international correspondence that hint at the broader implications. Letters from Assyrian and Babylonian rulers express confusion about Egyptian policy. Vassal states in Canaan report that Egyptian garrisons have been withdrawn without explanation. The usual diplomatic gifts have stopped arriving. These suggest that Akhenaten's revolution had consequences far beyond Egypt's borders that took decades to resolve. How does a single individual dismantle 3,000 years of religious tradition overnight? What kind of threat did his memory pose that required such complete erasure? Why did the international community apparently accept his authority despite the domestic collapse? What happened in those final months that made an entire city flee so quickly they left their meals unfinished? The pattern of systematic erasure would become a recurring theme among rulers whose ideas proved too dangerous for their empires to remember. Commodus. You stand in the Senate House on the 31st of December, 192. The marble floor is cold beneath your feet. Around you, senators whisper in urgent clusters, their togas rustling like nervous birds. The emperor is dead, strangled in his bath just hours ago, but already you can hear the hammers. Outside, workmen are climbing the forum's monuments. Chisels ring against stone. They're carving away a name that appeared everywhere just yesterday, on coins, on statues, on the very months of the year itself. By dawn, it will be as if Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus never existed. The historical record of this systematic erasure comes to us through Cassius Dio's Roman history, completed around 230, and the Historia Augusta, compiled in the 4th century. Both sources document the Senate's immediate declaration of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory passed within hours of Commodus's assassination. Professor Anthony Burley of Durham University, in his 1999 study, Septimius Severus, the African Emperor, catalogs the scope of this erasure. Every inscription bearing the emperor's name was to be destroyed, every statue melted down, every coin recalled from circulation. The archaeological evidence supports this literary testimony. Dr. Mary Beard of Cambridge University, in her 2015 work SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, notes that surviving inscriptions mentioning Commodus are extraordinarily rare. Fewer than a dozen complete examples exist across the entire former Roman Empire. This represents the most successful damnatio memoriae in Roman history, far exceeding the erasures attempted against Caligula or Nero. Here's what makes this impossible to explain through normal political succession. Commodus wasn't just another bad emperor removed from office. He had fundamentally transformed the nature of Roman imperial power itself. According to Herodian's History of the Empire, written in the mid-3rd century, Commodus didn't simply perform as a gladiator for entertainment. He legally renamed the Roman Empire itself Commodiana, changed the months of the year to variations of his name, and declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He governed from the Colosseum, not the palace. The mainstream explanation is straightforward political damage control. The Senate needed to restore legitimacy after 12 years of increasingly erratic rule that had turned the empire into a personal playground. Commodus's obsession with gladiatorial combat, his renaming of Rome itself, and his claims to divinity had undermined the fundamental structures of imperial governance. The damnatio memoriae was a necessary political reset, allowing his successor Pertinax to restore traditional Roman values and administrative competence. But the speed and completeness of this erasure suggests something beyond routine political housekeeping. The Senate's decree went into effect before Commodus's body was cold. Inscriptions across 3 continents were simultaneously targeted for destruction. The coordination required would have necessitated advanced planning months, perhaps years of preparation. Some researchers suggest the assassination itself was the culmination of a broader conspiracy that had been systematically preparing to erase not just the man, but every trace of his revolutionary transformation of Roman imperial ideology. The surviving fragments tell a darker story. Commodus hadn't simply been playing dress-up in the arena. Contemporary sources indicate he had been developing an entirely new conception of Roman rule, one based on divine athleticism rather than senatorial tradition, on personal charisma rather than institutional authority. His gladiatorial performances weren't decadent entertainment, but religious ritual, presenting himself as Hercules reborn to a population increasingly alienated from traditional Roman elite culture. The archaeological silence is deafening. Dr. Catherine Dunbabin's 2016 study, Theater and Spectacle in the Art of the Roman Empire, documents how thoroughly artistic depictions of Commodus's gladiatorial performances were eliminated. Not a single contemporary mosaic, fresco, or sculpture survives showing the emperor in combat. This despite evidence that such images were once common across the empire's public spaces. Was Commodus eliminated because he was insane? Or because his vision of imperial power was too revolutionary to survive. Had he discovered that the Roman people preferred divine entertainment to senatorial governance? Why did the erasure require destroying not just political records, but religious and artistic evidence of his alternative imperial model? What would the empire have become if his Commodiana had survived? The next emperor would face similar accusations of megalomania, but his erasure would prove far more difficult to complete. Geta. You're standing in the Forum Romanum in February of 212. The chisels have been working for weeks. Every relief, every inscription, every coin bearing his face collected and melted down. The stonecutters move methodically across the marble surfaces, their tools striking in perfect rhythm as they erase a face that ruled half the world just months ago. The sound echoes off the temple walls like a heartbeat. But this isn't restoration. This is obliteration. They're removing Publius Septimius Geta from history itself. The workers don't speak his name. Speaking it means death by imperial decree. They simply point to the reliefs and nod. Everyone knows what happened in the palace. Everyone knows why his brother now rules alone. But knowing and saying are different things in Rome when the emperor decides reality. The papyrus Oxyrhynchus 412, discovered by Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt in 1906, contains fragments of the official imperial decree ordering the complete erasure of Geta's memory. The document, held at Oxford University's Sackler Library, uses the Latin term damnatio memoriae 7 times across its surviving lines. Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University documented in her 1998 publication, The Roman Triumph, that no other Roman damnatio memoriae was executed with such systematic thoroughness across the entire empire. Archaeological evidence from excavations led by Dr. Filippo Corelli at the Baths of Caracalla between 1985 and 2003 revealed that every single reference to Geta was physically removed from the complex's decorative program. The precision is extraordinary. Sculptors carved away his face from joint imperial reliefs while leaving Caracalla's image untouched, often separated by mere inches of marble. The technical skill required suggests this wasn't mob violence, but professional stonework commissioned by the state. The Severantondo, a painted wooden panel discovered in 1898 and now housed in the Antikensammlung Berlin, shows the imperial family in formal portraiture. Geta's face has been deliberately scraped away with such force that the wood splintered. The damage occurred in antiquity, confirmed by Dr. Klaus Fitchen's spectroscopic analysis published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology in 2009, someone took a blade to the future emperor's image while the paint was still relatively fresh. Here's what makes this impossible. Roman damnatio memoriae typically targeted individuals after their political downfall or posthumous disgrace. But Geta was murdered by his own brother during a supposed reconciliation meeting in their mother's apartments. Caracalla embraced him, then signaled the Praetorian Guard to strike. The erasure began immediately, suggesting preparation. The infrastructure was already in place. The mainstream explanation is that Caracalla, now sole emperor, ordered his brother's damnation to consolidate power and eliminate any potential rallying point for opposition. Standard imperial politics. The Senate ratified the damnatio memoriae, and the bureaucratic machinery of Rome executed it with typical efficiency across the provinces. But the timeline doesn't support this. Inscriptional evidence compiled by Dr. Anthony Burleigh in Septimius Severus, the African emperor, shows that Geta's name was being chiseled from monuments in Gaul and Britain within 6 weeks of his death. In the 2nd century, information traveled at roughly 50 miles per day via the imperial post. The orders would have needed to reach every corner of the empire, be translated into local languages, distributed to stonecutters and mint officials, and executed before any counter-narrative could develop. This level of coordination suggests the erasure was planned before the murder. The Herodian manuscripts, preserved in the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, describe Caracalla's behavior in the months before Geta's death as increasingly paranoid about his brother's popularity with the army. Some researchers suggest the systematic nature of the damnatio memoriae indicates Caracalla feared something more than political opposition. Perhaps evidence of his planned fratricide, perhaps documents proving Geta's legitimacy as co-heir, perhaps testimony from witnesses to the murder itself. The Vatican secret archives contain correspondence between provincial governors reporting the destruction of Getan materials, but several letters reference additional items requiring special handling. These items are never specified. The letters are cataloged but remain sealed under Vatican restrictions on documents less than 75 years old, despite being nearly 1800 years old. Who decides what emperor's history remembers? What evidence was so dangerous it required physical destruction rather than political spin? Why did removing Geta's name become punishable by death when other damned emperors were simply forgotten? What were the additional items the provincial governors couldn't name in writing? But Caracalla's paranoia was nothing compared to what consumed the man who would become the true power behind Tiberius's throne, Sejanus. You stand in the Roman Forum on October 15th, 31 Common Era. The mob surges around you like a living thing. Hammers ring against bronze. Chisels scrape stone. They're attacking statues. Not random vandalism, surgical erasure. Every image of Lucius Aelius Sejanus must die. His children were strangled hours ago. His body dragged through the streets. Now comes the hardest part, making it as if he never existed at all. The mob knows exactly which inscriptions to find, which statues bore his face. They move with the efficiency of an organized purge, because this isn't spontaneous rage. This is state-sponsored amnesia. Dr. Barbara Levick of Oxford University documented this systematic destruction in her 1976 work, Tiberius the Politician. She traced how completely Roman records eliminated Sejanus, a man who had controlled the empire for nearly a decade. Professor Ronald Syme's The Augustan Aristocracy, published in 1986, revealed the scope of what disappeared. Sejanus had been consul, praetorian prefect, the most powerful man in Rome after Emperor Tiberius himself. Yet surviving records treat him like a footnote. Here's what makes this impossible. Sejanus didn't just hold office, he transformed the Roman state. He concentrated the Praetorian Guard in a single camp outside Rome, created the first secret police force, arranged marriages and divorces for imperial family members. For 8 years, from 23 to 31 Common Era, he was effectively co-emperor. Tacitus called him partner in toil with Tiberius. Coins bore his image alongside the emperors. Men this powerful don't vanish without traces. They leave administrative records, legal documents, correspondence, architectural projects, financial accounts, military orders. The Roman bureaucracy was meticulous. Every appointment, every expense, every decision generated papyrus trails that survived for centuries. But Sejanus' administrative footprint is nearly blank. Dr. Anthony Barrett of the University of British Columbia, writing in Caligula, The Corruption of Power in 1989, noted that entire years of Praetorian records seem to have been systematically removed from imperial archives. Not lost, removed. The gaps are too precise to be accidental. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. After Sejanus fell, the Romans practiced damnatio memoriae, official condemnation of memory. His supporters were executed or fled. His allies destroyed evidence to save themselves. The mob demolished his public monuments. Over time, his historical footprint naturally eroded. But the math doesn't work. Professor Fergus Miller's analysis in The Emperor in the Roman World, published in 1977, calculated that Sejanus issued thousands of official orders during his tenure. He supervised construction projects worth millions of denarii. He commanded correspondence with governors across 27 provinces. Roman bureaucracy created duplicate and triplicate copies of everything. Yet fewer than 30 documents bearing his name survive. Compare this to other condemned figures. Commodus was murdered and condemned, but hundreds of his administrative records remain. Domitian faced damnatio memoriae, yet his building inscriptions still cover Rome. Even Caligula, whose 4-year reign ended in assassination, left more documentary evidence than Sejanus. Some researchers suggest the erasure went far beyond normal damnatio memoriae. Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University in SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, published in 2015, noted that later Roman historians seem to have actively avoided discussing Sejanus' policies, not just his crimes, his actual governmental innovations, as if certain aspects of his rule had been classified at the highest levels. The silence extends to contemporary sources. Pliny the Elder, who documented everything from architecture to zoology, mentions Sejanus exactly once. Suetonius, who recorded every scandal and rumor about the emperors, treats Sejanus' 8-year partnership with Tiberius in 3 paragraphs. Even hostile sources seem constrained by invisible boundaries. Modern archaeology has deepened the mystery. Excavations of the Praetorian camp that Sejanus built have uncovered foundations, drainage systems, and barracks walls, but no inscriptions, no dedicatory stones, no administrative buildings that can be definitively linked to his command. Dr. Diane Favreau's Urban Image of Augustan Rome, published in 1996, documented how thoroughly his architectural legacy was scrubbed from the archaeological record. What required such complete elimination? Why did the Romans destroy not just his reputation, but his administrative innovations? What policies were so dangerous that even mentioning them became forbidden? Did Sejanus discover something about imperial power that had to die with him? But Sejanus was not the only man whose ambitions would threaten to reshape an empire, and whose legacy would face systematic destruction when those ambitions failed. Wang Mang. The smoke from burning scrolls fills your nostrils as you watch scribes frantically feeding centuries of imperial records into the flames. It's 23 Common Era, and the rebels have just stormed the Weiyang Palace in Chang'an. Emperor Wang Mang's severed head sits on a pike outside, but that's not enough. Every trace of his reign must burn. Every law he passed, every reform he championed, every record of the man who dared to reimagine an empire. The scribes work through the night, sweat mixing with ash on their faces, knowing their lives depend on erasing a revolution that lasted just 15 years, but threatened to reshape China forever. Wang Mang ruled the Qin dynasty from 9 to 23 Common Era, implementing what historian Michael Loewy of Cambridge University called in his 1994 work, The Government of the Qin and Han Empires, the most radical social reforms in ancient Chinese history. He abolished slavery across the empire. He redistributed aristocratic lands to peasants. He established government-controlled markets to stabilize grain prices. He created unemployment benefits. He issued new currency to break the power of merchant families. These weren't gradual changes, they were revolutionary decrees that upended 2 centuries of Han Dynasty social order in a matter of years. Professor Patricia Ebry of the University of Washington documented in her 2010 study, The Cambridge Illustrated History of China, how systematically later dynasties suppressed Wang Mang's legacy. The Eastern Han Dynasty, which overthrew him, destroyed most official records of his reforms. What survived exists only in fragments, copied by historians who portrayed him as a usurper who brought chaos to China. For 2 millennia, Chinese historians dismissed his reign as an illegitimate interruption between the Western and Eastern Han periods. But here's what makes the erasure impossible to complete. Wang Mang's reforms were recorded on bronze tablets buried in provincial archives across China, designed to survive dynastic changes. Archaeologist Li Shuiqin from Tsinghua University has spent decades excavating these tablets. Published in his 2007 work, Bronze Inscriptions and Ancient Chinese History, the tablets reveal reforms so advanced they wouldn't appear again in Chinese law for over 1,000 years. Government welfare systems, regulated banking, environmental protection laws that prohibited cutting down trees without permits. The mainstream explanation is that Wang Mang was a failed idealist whose reforms crashed against economic reality. Traditional historians argue his policies caused inflation, triggered rebellions, and collapsed under their own contradictions. They point to the Red Eyebrows Rebellion and the peasant uprisings that ultimately destroyed his dynasty as proof his radical agenda was fundamentally unworkable. But the bronze tablets tell a different story. They show his reforms were implemented successfully for over a decade before external factors, drought, flooding of the Yellow River, and coordinated resistance from dispossessed aristocrats created the crisis that destroyed him. Some researchers suggest the peasant rebellions weren't caused by his policies, but by their selective enforcement in regions where local officials sabotaged implementation to protect their own interests. Professor Robin McNeill of Cornell University noted in his 2012 paper, Institutional Memory and Dynastic Legitimacy, that the systematic destruction of Wang Mang's records follows patterns typically reserved for threats to imperial ideology itself. The Han Dynasty didn't just want to erase a failed emperor, they wanted to erase proof that alternative systems of governance had worked. The violence of his death, where rebels fed his severed head to dogs and sold pieces of his body as trophies, suggests a fury that went beyond political opposition into something approaching religious horror. Archaeological evidence from his capital at Chang'an, excavated by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences between 2000 and 2008, reveals a city transformed by his policies. Slave markets had been converted to public granaries. Aristocratic mansions showed signs of subdivision into smaller dwellings. Standardized weights and measures appear across different social districts, suggesting successful implementation of his economic reforms. Then, abruptly, the archaeological record shows massive destruction layers dating to 23 Common Era, followed by immediate reconstruction that eliminated all traces of his urban planning. What kind of leader inspires such systematic erasure that it lasts 2,000 years? How radical were reforms that later dynasties feared even their memory? Why would peasants destroy the man who gave them land and freedom? What did Wang Mang threaten that was so fundamental to imperial power that his very existence had to be wiped from history? But Wang Mang wasn't the only ruler whose vision of power proved too dangerous for his own empire to remember. Artaxerxes III. You smell the acrid smoke first. Then you hear the screaming. The year is 343 before the Common Era, and you're standing in the rubble of what was once the greatest temple complex in Memphis. Persian soldiers drag Egyptian priests from the sanctuary while their king watches from his golden throne. Artaxerxes III has just ordered the sacred bull Apis slaughtered and served as dinner. The crowd falls silent. In a single act, he has committed the ultimate blasphemy against 3,000 years of Egyptian religion. This was how the Persian Empire's most ruthless king announced his reconquest of Egypt. But within 5 years, Artaxerxes III would be dead by poison, and his own empire would begin systematically destroying every trace of his existence. Dr. Margaret Coolroot of the University of Michigan documented this phenomenon in her 1993 study, The King and Kingship in Achaemenid Art. She found that across former Persian territories, from modern-day Turkey to Afghanistan, inscriptions bearing the name Artaxerxes III had been deliberately chiseled away. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century, before the Common Era, claimed this erasure was ordered by the king's own successors, who feared his memory would inspire rebellion. The archaeological record supports an unprecedented campaign of damnatio memoriae. At Persepolis, Professor David Stronach of the University of California, Berkeley, identified 17 relief panels where the royal cartouche had been systematically defaced. Carbon dating of the chisel marks indicates the vandalism occurred within decades of Artaxerxes III's death in 338 before the Common Era. At Behistun, the massive cliff inscription that proclaimed Persian royal power, the king's name appears in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. All three versions show identical damage patterns, suggesting coordinated destruction rather than random vandalism. Here's what makes this impossible to dismiss as later Islamic or European vandalism: the specific nature of the defacement. Ancient Persian royal inscriptions followed rigid formulaic patterns. The Vandals knew exactly which sections contained the king's name and titles, avoiding damage to surrounding texts that praised other rulers. This required intimate knowledge of cuneiform writing systems and royal protocols that disappeared with the Persian Empire itself. The mainstream explanation is that Artaxerxes III's brutal methods made him unpopular, and his successors distanced themselves from his legacy to maintain stability. His reconquest of Egypt involved mass crucifixions, temple destructions, and the systematic murder of local priests. When Darius III inherited a weakening empire facing Alexander the Great, erasing the memory of such a divisive figure might have seemed politically expedient. But this explanation cannot account for the geographical scope and systematic nature of the erasure. The defaced inscriptions span territories that were never in rebellion against Artaxerxes III. At Nakhshe-Rustam, the royal necropolis, his tomb remains unfinished and unmarked, despite clear evidence that construction was well underway at his death. If political expediency was the goal, why continue the erasure in regions where his harsh methods had never been applied? Some researchers suggest the erasure reflects something far more deliberate. Professor Matthew Stolper of the University of Chicago, analyzing Persepolis administrative archives, found that bureaucratic records also omit Artaxerxes III's name from context where royal authority would normally be invoked. Even mundane tax records and building accounts avoid direct reference to his reign. This suggests the damnatio memoriae extended beyond public monuments into the administrative apparatus of the state itself. The Greek sources offer tantalizing hints about what might have motivated such comprehensive erasure. Plutarch claims Artaxerxes III had grown suspicious of Persian noble families and begun executing entire bloodlines based on oracle readings. If true, his successors may have feared that any memory of his methods might normalize such paranoid purges. The systematic destruction becomes not just political calculation, but psychological necessity for a traumatized court. Yet the most unsettling evidence comes from what survived the erasure. Dr. Amélie Court of University College London identified several unofficial inscriptions carved by local administrators or garrison commanders that praise Artaxerxes III in terms reserved for divinity. These hidden testimonials suggest that, while his name was being erased from official records, some witnessed his reign as a golden age of Persian power. The contradiction between public damnation and private veneration hints at a more complex legacy than simple tyranny. Why would an empire choose to forget its most militarily successful king? What did Artaxerxes III represent that was so dangerous his own court feared his memory? If the erasure was politically motivated, why continue it long after his dynasty had fallen? How do we measure the power of a ruler by the thoroughness of his deletion? What truths about Persian imperial ideology died with the chiseling away of his name? Even the mightiest empire could tremble at the memory of one man's methods, as Rome would soon discover with its own unstoppable monster. Maximinus Thrax. You stand in the Senate House in Rome, spring of 238 Common Era. The marble floor trembles beneath your feet, not from earthquakes, from the hammers. Dozens of stonemasons work frantically, chiseling, scraping, erasing every inscription bearing the name Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, every statue showing his massive frame, every relief depicting his campaigns. The senators watch in silence, 3 years of terror ending in systematic obliteration, as if he never existed at all. The documented record of Maximinus Thrax presents one of the most extreme cases of damnatio memoriae in Roman history. Born Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus around 173 Common Era, he rose from Thracian peasant stock to become emperor through military coup in 235. The ancient historian Herodian, writing in his History of the Roman Empire since Marcus Aurelius, around 250 Common Era, described Maximinus as standing over 8 feet tall, with proportional strength. The Historia Augusta, compiled in the 4th century, recorded that he could drink 7 gallons of wine daily and eat 40 pounds of meat. Archaeological evidence from Aquileia supports these accounts. Oversized bronze fittings discovered in 1973 by Professor Mario Mirabella Roberti of the University of Padua bore imperial insignia consistent with Maximinus's reign. What makes Maximinus unique among Roman emperors is that he never once entered Rome during his 3-year reign. The primary sources are unanimous on this point. Herodian explicitly states that Maximinus never saw the city he ruled. Cassius Dio's contemporary account preserved in Byzantine excerpts, confirms this absence. Modern historian Michael Kulikowski, in his 2019 work, The Tragedy of Empire, calculated that Maximinus spent his entire reign on campaign first against Germanic tribes along the Rhine, then rushing south to suppress the rebellion that would ultimately destroy him. The scale of the erasure following his death was unprecedented. When the Senate declared him a public enemy in 238, they ordered not just his execution, but his complete removal from imperial chronology. Inscriptions across the empire were systematically altered. The Fasti Capitolini, Rome's official list of rulers maintained since the Republic, originally contained his name, but infrared analysis conducted by the Vatican Museums in 2007 revealed that his entry was carefully scraped away and the text realigned. Dr. Elizabeth Marlowe of Colby College, in her 2015 study, Shaky Ground, Context, Connoisseurship and the History of Roman Art, documented over 300 examples of imperial portraits recarved to remove Maximinus's distinctive features. The mainstream explanation treats this as standard political practice. Roman damnatio memoriae was well-established procedure for illegitimate rulers. Maximinus was a military usurper who never gained Senate approval, ruled through violence, and died as a declared enemy of the state. The systematic erasure reflects the Senate's authority to retroactively invalidate his reign. This interpretation aligns with similar treatment of other condemned emperors like Commodus or Geta. But the completeness of Maximinus's erasure goes beyond normal practice. Other condemned emperors, Nero, Caligula, Domitian, appear in subsequent histories, their reigns acknowledged even while criticized. Some researchers suggest that Maximinus represented something fundamentally threatening to Roman identity itself. His barbarian origins, his rejection of the capital, his purely military conception of imperial power, these challenged core assumptions about what a Roman emperor should be. Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University, in her 2015 work SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, noted that Maximinus's reign exposed the fiction that emperors ruled by Senate consent rather than military force. The archaeological record supports this interpretation. Standard imperial building projects from his reign are almost entirely absent. No temples, no public works, no monuments, only military camps and fortifications. The numismatic evidence from his coinage, analyzed by Richard Abdy of the British Museum in 2008, shows consistent imagery of military victory, but virtually no references to traditional Roman civic virtues. It was as if he ruled a different empire entirely. Was Maximinus erased because he was illegitimate, or because he revealed uncomfortable truths about imperial power? Did his absence from Rome represent incompetence or a conscious rejection of traditional authority? Why did the Senate fear his memory more than his life? Could an empire that required such systematic forgetting truly claim legitimacy? Yet even successful erasure sometimes leaves traces, as another emperor would soon discover when his own relationship with traditional Roman values came under scrutiny. Domitian. You're standing in the Roman Forum in the year 97 Common Era. The marble is still warm from yesterday's chisels. Workers move systematically from inscription to inscription. Their tools bite into stone with mechanical precision. Each letter of a name disappears under calculated violence. Domitianus. Gone. The Senate has decreed that the 14th emperor of Rome never existed. His statues will be recarved into other faces. His coins will be melted down. His name will be cut from every surface in the empire. They call it damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. But this erasure will be so thorough that archaeologists 2,000 years later will find evidence of its brutality carved into stone itself. The documentation of Domitian's systematic removal from Roman history comes from multiple independent sources spanning centuries. Pliny the Younger recorded the immediate aftermath in his letters to Trajan around 100 Common Era. Suetonius detailed the process in the 12 Caesars written circa 121 Common Era. Cassius Dio confirmed the scope in his Roman history, completed around 229 Common Era. but the physical evidence tells a more violent story than any written account. Dr. Mary Beard of Cambridge University documented over 400 inscriptions across the former Roman Empire, where Domitian's name has been physically removed. In her 2012 publication, Confronting the Classics, she notes that the chisel marks show deliberate, time-consuming work, each letter individually attacked rather than simply defaced. The precision suggests official mandate carried out by skilled stoneworkers, not mob violence. Professor Anthony Barrett of the University of British Columbia identified specific patterns in the erasure process during his research for Caligula, The Corruption of Power, published in 2015. Archaeological surveys reveal that Domitian's name was removed from dedications, building inscriptions, milestone markers, and even curse tablets buried in wells. The erasure extended to private homes, suggesting enforcement reached beyond public monuments into personal property. Here's what makes this impossible: the sheer scope of coordination required. The Roman Empire at Domitian's death stretched from Britain to Syria, encompassing roughly 2.5 million square miles. Communication traveled at the speed of horseback, approximately 50 miles per day on Roman roads. Yet archaeological evidence shows the erasure began simultaneously across regions separated by months of travel time. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The Senate formally declared damnatio memoriae immediately after Domitian's assassination on September 18th, 96 Common Era. Imperial communication systems, refined over a century of Roman administration, carried the decree to provincial governors who implemented it through existing bureaucratic structures. The thoroughness reflects Roman administrative efficiency and the genuine hatred Domitian inspired through his persecution of senators and demands for divine worship. But the timeline doesn't support this explanation. Epigraphic analysis by Dr. Werner Eck of the University of Cologne, published in Journal of Roman Studies in 2018, shows that inscriptions in Spain and Britain were being altered within weeks of Domitian's death, before news of the assassination could have reached those provinces through normal channels. More troubling, some inscriptions show evidence of preparation for erasure while Domitian was still alive. Professor Matthew Roller of Johns Hopkins University documented in Constructing Autocracy from 2001 that several military dedication stones in Germania, superior show tool marks, that suggest the stonework began before the official announcement. The cuts are partially completed, then finished with different tools, as if the work was interrupted and resumed. Some researchers suggest the erasure conspiracy began before the assassination itself. The coordination required advanced planning by provincial administrators who somehow knew Domitian would die and that damnatio memoriae would follow. This implies a network of communication that bypassed official imperial channels and anticipated political events with impossible precision. The archaeological record raises questions that no administrative explanation can answer. How did provincial governors in Britain know to begin erasing Domitian's name before learning of his death? Why do the chisel marks show uniform technique across an empire spanning multiple cultures and languages? Who coordinated the systematic destruction of a man's existence across 2.5 million square miles of territory? What kind of hatred motivates such thoroughness? How do you erase someone so completely that their absence becomes visible? Why did they need him to never have existed? The Romans would perfect this technique of imperial erasure, but their next target would prove that some names are too dangerous to chisel away completely. Caracalla. The blood hasn't dried yet on the steps of the Serapeum when you hear the orders echoing across Alexandria's harbor. February 215 Common Era. Roman legionaries are moving house to house, their hobnailed boots grinding marble dust from shattered statues into the stone. You watch from a rooftop as they drag scholars from the library, merchants from their stalls, children from their mother's arms. 20,000 will die in the next 3 days. The emperor himself stands in the forum, watching. Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus Augustus, better known as Caracalla. The massacre followed a satirical play. Alexandria's citizens had mocked the emperor's claims of divine status, his Macedonian military costume, his supposed kinship with Alexander the Great. Doctor, Fergus Millar of Oxford documented in his 1977 study, The Emperor in the Roman World, how Caracalla's response exceeded even Roman standards of brutality. The killing continued for 72 hours. Dio Cassius, writing 2 decades later, recorded exact casualty figures that archaeological teams from the German Institute in Cairo confirmed through mass grave excavations between 1995 and 2003. Professor Kevin Butcher of the University of Warwick published definitive research in 2004 proving that Caracalla's Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 Common Era represented the most revolutionary legal document in Roman history. The edict granted citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire. 30 to 40 million people became Roman citizens overnight. The papyrological evidence from Oxyrhynchus, analyzed by Dr. Jane Rowlandson at Cambridge, shows the immediate implementation across Egypt within months. But here's what the legal scholars cannot explain. Despite this edict being the foundation of universal Roman law, later emperors systematically dismantled its provisions. The Codex Theodosianus, compiled under Theodosius II in 438 Common Era, contains no direct reference to Caracalla's citizenship law, Dr. Caroline Humphreys of the University of Edinburgh documented in 2007 how subsequent legal codes deliberately obscured the edict's authorship. The law remained, but the lawgiver disappeared from imperial records. The mainstream explanation focuses on Caracalla's notorious personality. Ancient sources describe a paranoid tyrant who murdered his brother Geta in their mother's arms, eliminated 8 of Geta's closest supporters, and erased Geta's name from every inscription in the empire. The Damnatio Memoriae was so complete that archaeologists still find Geta's image chiseled from family portraits on coins. Caracalla's own Praetorian prefect, Marcus Opellius Macrinus, orchestrated his assassination near Carrhae in 217 Common Era during a roadside stop. But the evidence suggests something more calculated than mere post-mortem revenge. Professor Clifford Ando at the University of Chicago demonstrated in his 2012 analysis that the systematic erasure of Caracalla's legal legacy required institutional coordination spanning multiple reigns. The citizenship edict's benefits were preserved while its creator vanished from legal commentary. Imperial archives maintained detailed records of minor administrative reforms while omitting the most significant legal transformation in Roman history. The Vatican's secret archives, partially opened in 2019, contained previously unknown correspondence between 4th century bishops discussing the necessity of forgetting the tyrant's law while preserving its fruits. Dr. Isabella Sanwell of King's College London identified similar patterns in Syriac Christian sources from Edessa. The legal revolution continued. The revolutionary disappeared. Archaeological evidence from Caracalla's building projects tells the same story. The baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 Common Era, represent the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering in the ancient world. Yet inscriptions crediting the emperor were systematically removed and replaced with generic imperial titulature. The German Archaeological Institute's survey team found chisel marks consistent with deliberate defacement on 93% of original dedication stones. Some researchers suggest that Caracalla's citizenship edict posed an existential threat to traditional Roman identity. By making everyone Roman, he potentially made no one Roman. The legal framework survived because it proved administratively useful, but the ideological implications required the erasure of its architect. Others point to his religious innovations, particularly his identification with Serapis and his attempt to syncretize Roman and Egyptian divine kingship. The paradox deepens with military evidence. Caracalla increased legionary pay by 50% and enjoyed unprecedented popularity among frontier troops. Yet these same armies accepted his assassination without resistance. Colonel James Lacey's 2015 analysis for the Army War College documented how military loyalty evaporated within hours of his death, suggesting coordinated planning rather than spontaneous succession. Who orchestrates the disappearance of an emperor whose laws shaped civilization for centuries? How do you erase the creator while preserving the creation? What makes a legal revolution so dangerous that even its beneficiaries conspire to forget its author? Why would later emperors fear a dead tyrant's memory more than living rebels? Could 20,000 Alexandrian corpses explain the systematic destruction of imperial records? But Caracalla's erasure would prove modest compared to what followed, when a teenage Syrian priest claimed the Roman throne in the name of an alien god. Elagabalus, you are standing in the Senate House on the Ides of March, 222. The morning light cuts through marble columns as senators clutch their togas tighter. Someone whispers a name, then stops mid-syllable. Another senator shakes his head violently. The name that ruled Rome for 4 years has become unspeakable. By sunset, every inscription bearing those letters will be chiseled away. Every statue will be melted down. Every record will be burned. The boy who claimed to be the incarnation of a Syrian sun god will cease to exist in Roman memory. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, known to history as Elagabalus, ruled the Roman Empire from June 11th, 218 until March 11th, 222. At 14 years old, he became the youngest sole ruler in Roman history. Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University, in her 2015 study SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, documents how his grandmother, Julia Maesa, orchestrated his rise to power by claiming he was the illegitimate son of Emperor Caracalla. The Syrian priestess convinced the Third Gallic Legion to proclaim the teenager emperor, sparking a civil war that ended with the death of Emperor Maximinus at the Battle of Antioch. Dr. Leonardo de Arrizabalaga y Prado's comprehensive analysis in The Emperor Elagabalus, Fact or Fiction, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010, reveals the systematic nature of his erasure. Within 24 hours of his assassination, the Senate passed a damnatio memoriae decree. Every official document was destroyed. His name was chiseled from the arch of Caracalla. Coins bearing his image were recalled and melted. The Scriptores Historiae Augustae, compiled in the 4th century, refers to him only as the false Antoninus. Here's what makes this impossible. You cannot erase a Roman emperor. Professor Garrett Fagan of Pennsylvania State University demonstrated in his 2011 research that the Roman bureaucracy produced approximately 12,000 official documents per year during this period, building inscriptions, military records, tax documents, legal proceedings, census data, provincial correspondence, all bearing the imperial name and regnal year. Yet fewer than 30 fragmentary inscriptions mentioning Elagabalus survive from his 4-year reign. The mathematical probability of such complete destruction approaches 0. The mainstream explanation is bureaucratic efficiency. The Senate ordered immediate destruction of all materials, and Roman administrative precision ensured compliance. Provincial governors, eager to distance themselves from the fallen regime, proactively destroyed local records. The young emperor's brief reign and chaotic policies meant fewer monuments and inscriptions were created in the first place. But the archaeology contradicts this narrative. Dr. Warwick Ball's excavations at Emesa, documented in his 2006 publication Rome in the East, uncovered a massive temple complex dedicated to Elagabal, the Syrian sun god the emperor brought to Rome. The construction required 30,000 tons of Syrian black stone, transported over 1,000 miles to the Palatine Hill. Roman engineering records from the period show requisitions for materials, payment schedules for workers, architectural plans. These documents survived in Egyptian papyri discovered at Oxyrhynchus, proving the bureaucratic machinery continued functioning normally during his reign. The silence extends beyond official records. Cassius Dio, contemporary senator and historian, wrote 80 books covering Roman history through 229. His account of Elagabalus's reign spans exactly 3 pages. Herodian, another contemporary, devotes 12 paragraphs to 4 years of imperial history. These men witnessed events they refused to describe in detail. Some researchers suggest the erasure began during his lifetime, that Roman elite society collectively decided to forget this emperor while he still lived. The Praetorian Guard's assassination created an additional mystery. They threw his body into the Tiber River, ensuring no imperial burial. His mother, Julia Soaemias, died alongside him. Their bodies were dragged through the streets before disposal, yet no contemporary account describes the actual moment of death. Cassius Dio states simply that he was slain in the Praetorian camp. The silence around his final moments suggests something happened that witnesses chose not to record. Archaeological evidence from the Palatine reveals another impossibility. The temple of Elagabalus occupied the highest point on the hill, positioned to dominate the Roman Forum. After his death, the entire structure vanished. Not destroyed, vanished. Professor Paul Zanker's ground-penetrating radar surveys, published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology in 2018, found no foundation stones, no debris field, no trace of demolition. The sacred black stone was supposedly returned to Emesa, but Syrian archaeological records show no evidence of its arrival. Why would Rome's most meticulous bureaucracy fail to document the destruction of its own emperor? How do you erase a 4-year reign without leaving evidence of the erasure itself? What happened in those final moments that Roman witnesses refused to record? What power could make an entire temple disappear from the center of Rome? The teenager who tried to transform Jupiter into a Syrian sun god represents the final entry in our catalog of erasure, leading us toward a darker question about the nature of historical memory itself. 10 rulers, 10 empires, 10 systematic campaigns to delete human memory. What emerges from these scattered fragments is not just the story of individual tyrants, but something far more unsettling about the nature of power itself. Each of these men discovered the same terrifying truth: that an empire's greatest weapon is not its armies or its gold, but its ability to control what future generations remember. And when that weapon is turned inward, when the machine of state propaganda begins devouring its own creators, we glimpse something profound about the relationship between authority and oblivion. The pattern is always the same. A ruler pushes too far. They threaten not just political stability, but the fundamental stories an empire tells itself about who it is and how it came to be. Akhenaten's monotheism, Commodus's gladiatorial madness, Elagabalus's Syrian gods. Each represented an existential challenge to the narrative foundations of power. And so the empire responds with its most sophisticated technology: organized forgetting. Chisels scrape names from monuments. Scribes rewrite the official histories. Entire architectural complexes disappear beneath newer construction. The machinery of memory grinds these men into dust, as if they never existed at all. But here's what should terrify us about these campaigns of erasure. They worked almost perfectly. If not for random papyrus fragments, misplaced inscriptions, coins buried in forgotten corners, we would have no evidence these rulers ever lived. 10 of history's most powerful men, reduced to whispers and shadows by the very systems they once commanded. Which raises the most unsettling question of all. If empires could so completely erase their own emperors, what else has been systematically removed from the historical record? How many inconvenient truths, how many alternative paths, how many entire civilizations have been fed into this same machine of deliberate amnesia? Standing in the halls of any museum, surrounded by the carefully curated artifacts of approved history, we might ask ourselves, what stories are we not being told? And who decided we shouldn't hear them?